Welcome to Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Well, Christmas is coming up in just about a week. So that means, of course, the internet is full of people claiming that Jesus was a Palestinian. Now, this has, of course, been in the news, and there's plenty of articles talking about this over the last 10, 20, 30 years. But this year, it seems to have stepped it up a notch, as even the Vatican in their nativity scene had baby Jesus wrapped around a keffiyeh. If you are listening to this, I highly implore you to pause this podcast for a second, go and Google it, and you can actually see, the Vatican, of course, the center of the Catholic world, producing a baby Jesus with a keffiyeh wrapped around it. Now, this is a fascinating topic for a whole variety of reasons, because the claim that Jesus was Palestinian touches on a whole host of historical misconceptions, I would say anti-Semitism, a whitewashing / erasure of Jewish history. So I wanted to talk about this for just a couple of minutes about both the history and all of the implicit assumptions that are made in this claim that Jesus was a Palestinian. So one, let's talk about the history of the term Palestinian. Then we'll talk about the history of the term Israel / Judaism afterwards. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history of Jesus. So there's, of course, like a lot of things, a scholarly debate about the origins of the term Palestinian. Most historians think Palestinian comes from the Philistines. If you remember back from, Hebrew school, or if you don't, the Philistines were an ancient peoples, oftentimes quoted in the Tanakh. There was a rivalry between the Philistines and the Israelites, but the Philistines were the people that were on the sea, the western side of the land of Israel, on the Mediterranean. Places like Ashkelon, places like the modern-day Gaza Strip were often controlled by the Philistines. Now, nobody would have really called this area Palestine or Philistine, but in some ancient Greek texts going back to maybe the 6th, then 5th, and more so in the 4th century BCE, you start to see some Greek writers referring to some part of modern-day Israel as Philistina. But again, this wouldn't have been any specific identity, or there would have been no Philistinian state or anything like that. It's not really until the Roman takeover of ancient Israel, now we're going all the way to the 1st century BCE, that the Romans take this area that was, of course, referred to as Israel by the Hasmonean Empire, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, and specifically renamed the area Palestina to specifically de-Judify the area. So now just a little bit of historic context on that. Obviously, for those that are familiar with Jewish history, if you're not, I actually have a great 20-part Jewish history series on my YouTube, so you can go find that. But the history of Jews in the land of Israel is fascinating. Of course, one of the main historical events was the exile in the 6th century BCE. This is when the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple, razed Jerusalem, and exiled the Israelites to the land of Babylonia. This is actually when really Jewish identity starts to emerge, but enough about that tangent for now. When the Jews are allowed back into the land of Israel by King Cyrus, the Jews still had no political autonomy. And so we have the Persian Empire with Jews having no political autonomy. And then after the Persian Empire, we have Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire coming into the area, and Jews still have no political autonomy. This would continue for a couple hundred years until, of course, the famous Hanukkah story. I'll probably do another episode before Hanukkah, but the Hanukkah story is the Jewish takeover of political autonomy over the land of Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, from the Greek Empire in the 2nd century BCE. This ushered in the second Jewish Commonwealth, and what I mean by Commonwealth is the second time in Jewish history that Jews were in political control over the land of Israel. The first time, of course, was the First Temple period, starting with King David and his son Solomon, but the Hasmonean Empire, the family of the Maccabees, ended up ruling for the next 100 years. And there's a lot of fascinating history there with the Hasmonean Empire and the Maccabees. I'll probably address that in the Hanukkah episode. But when the Roman Empire finally takes over about 100 years later in the 1st century BCE, they specifically want to remind the Jews that this is no longer called Judea or no longer called the land of Israel. So they renamed it Roma Palestina, as if to say this is no longer Judea, no longer the land of Israel. So even the explicit naming of this area as Palestine by the Roman Empire was a direct and explicit way to signal that this is no longer the land of the Jews. Now, it should go without saying, this is before anything like a contemporary Palestinian identity would have formed. I'll discuss in about 5 or 10 minutes where different scholars think that modern day Palestinian identity actually formed from, but I can promise you there was nobody in the year 0 or the year 50 that would have identified as a Palestinian that would have had anything to do with, fast forward 2,000 years, modern day Palestinians. A brief history about the term Israel, just because I think it provides a nice parallel. There's a lot of debate and discussion as to when the Bible, when the Tanakh actually intersects with quote unquote real history. There's a lot to say there, but already by the year 1200 BCE, this is at the dawn of the Iron Age, we have on what's called the Merneptah Stela. You can still Google this today. It's this very nice big rock, and it refers to the land of Israel. It actually refers to the land of Israel, not in a positive way. It says Israel has been burned to the ground or razed to the ground or destroyed. I'm forgetting the exact wording. And this is obviously the result of some war where ancient Israel lost. But already by 1200 BCE, this is again 3,200 years ago, you have the term Israel popping up on these archaeological stelas. A stela is just a large rock with an inscription on it. It's where we have most of our old ancient archaeological evidence referring to the land of Israel. Now, of course, scholars can and will debate what type of Israel, did Jews have / did the Israelites have political control over this entire area? What exactly was happening? Does this coincide with the story in the Tanakh / Hebrew Bible? But all of those academic questions aside, by the year 1200 BCE, you did have this conception of Israel. And of course, for those that know their history / know their Tanakh, the people of Israel ended up evolving into the land of Israel. And this is what King David and his son Solomon ended up ruling. And so the idea of this land being called Israel had already been established for at least 3,000 years. Now, it's important to note just a couple things. From some perspective, from an ancient perspective, this is just a literary exercise of what we call this land, because this has nothing to do with when people started to identify as modern-day Palestinians. In fact, there's actually an interesting aside. I was going to discuss this in about 10 minutes, but I'll say this now and go into it a little bit more later. Many people, if you go back 100 years ago, let's say you enter the time machine and pop up in the post-World War I era in the land of Israel / Palestine, you're in the 1920s in the land of British Mandate Palestine. Most people who would have identified themselves as Palestinian were actually probably Zionist Jews. Now, I'll talk and unpack that statement in a little bit, but certainly when we're talking about the 1st century CE, a character like Jesus, who of course was born into a Jewish family, he identified as Jewish. It's actually very unclear, and I'll discuss this for a little bit about Jesus's Jewish identity and whether or not Jesus saw himself as a part of the Jewish tradition or was actually trying to form a new offshoot that eventually obviously becomes Christianity. There is no chance Jesus would have identified himself as something that was other than Judean / Jewish. And it was only the Romans who were attempting to call this place something other than Judea, right? Judea is just, Jewish is just from the word Judea, right? The Judeans. So it was the Romans that were trying to disconnect Jewish attachment to the land. So let's unpack Jesus a little bit, because Jesus arises in one of the most interesting historical periods that have possibly happened in Jewish history. There are a lot of very interesting episodes in Jewish history, but this 150 years of Roman occupation of the land of Israel between when the Hasmonean Empire falls and the Second Temple is destroyed, this is roughly from about the year 69 BCE to the year 70 CE. So I guess 139 years, if I'm doing my math correctly. The Jewish world was in disarray. One, just going back to the Hasmonean Empire, the Hasmoneans obviously initially did a lot of, relatively positive things, right? We're all about to celebrate Hanukkah in a couple of days. And so we are happy that, yes, the Maccabees freed the temple from under Greek control. We're happy that there are no idols in the temple. We're happy that, they were able to light the menorah, and now we have a nice holiday every winter to compete with Christmas. So we definitely, yay, applaud the Maccabees for that. But the Hasmonean Empire itself was actually a very corrupt empire. This is actually the only time in Jewish history where Jews forcibly converted people. If you, again, pause this podcast for a second and just Google a map of the political geography under Hasmonean rule, you can actually see the Hasmonean Empire actually pushed and increased the map size of Israel, conquering other people. The Hasmoneans actually did something else that rabbis and Jewish scholars of later generations would view with a lot of scorn, which is they collapsed all separation of powers, right? the debates in politics haven't changed, whether we're talking about modern day America or modern day Israel from 2,200 years ago. But one of the things that the Hasmonean Empire did is the Tanakh and First Temple Judaism have a very clear separation of powers. Namely, the king is not allowed to be the high priest. And there was a very easy way to ensure this. The high priest had to be from the tribe of Aaron, right? Had to be a Kohen. And so that was the tribe of Levi, right? You would be the Levite tribe. And then under the Levite tribe, which was the umbrella, you would have the tribe of Kohanim, right? Of Kohen. And anybody who would be a high priest necessarily had to be a Kohen to be the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. If you were a king, you had to be from the tribe of Judah, right? King David, King Solomon, all the other kings of Judea were all part of the tribe of Judah. So by definition, a high priest could not be the king. This was true all throughout the First Temple period until, of course, the Hasmonean Empire. The Hasmoneans ended up collapsing the two when the high priest became the king, which was only the beginning of their corruption. And over time, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, switched from being a spiritual ritual figurehead that it was in the First Temple, right? Somebody who you would really trust and the people would trust to pray on behalf of the people, to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, to offer the Yom Kippur Day of Atonement sacrifice, which was, sort of the Super Bowl of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. All of a sudden, in the Second Temple under the Hasmonean Empire, the high priesthood or the entire enterprise of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, became devalued in people's eyes because unlike the First Temple, where the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, was this immense place of holiness that you would pilgrimage to 3 times a year, and you would offer, taxes to it happily, and you would bring your sacrifices, and it was a place that, parents would excitedly bring their children to, during the Shalosh Regalim, on Passover, on Shavuot, and on Sukkot. All of a sudden, the temple became really a corrupt, aging religious institution. And so you now have these two interesting things that are happening at the same time. You have a devaluation of the temple in Jerusalem, and now you also have a loss of political autonomy because the Roman Empire comes in and takes over the area. So all of a sudden, of course, the Jewish people in the first century, both BCE and then leading into CE, right? Let's just call it the year 0. The Jewish people in the year 0 had this big question of, what do we do now? And so we look to scholars and historians such as Josephus, who is the main one here, who tells us that, of course, if we know anything about the Jewish community, a multiplicity of factions arose among the Jewish community trying to answer these two questions. What do we do with the temple, and what do we do with political autonomy? So Josephus describes a number of different groups. The first group that he describes, we'll call it the Essenes, right? The Essenes are the most opaque and obscure of these groups. The Essenes are a ascetic people whose reaction to all this was basically, let's forget all of it. Let's forget political autonomy and let's forget the temple. The temple is corrupt. Even politics might be corrupt. Let's move out into the desert, right? Into the shores of the Dead Sea. If you've ever been to Israel on the shores of the Dead Sea, it is not the most hospitable place, right? It's arid, it's a desert, right? You could hardly get any natural water from the Dead Sea. And so there probably weren't many of them, maybe a couple hundred or a couple of thousand. But the Essenes ended up moving to the desert and coming up with their own community that was obsessed with ideas of ritual purity and impurity. They were most probably the authors of what's now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you've never heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, pause this podcast, Google the Dead Sea Scrolls, read about it a little bit, and then unpause the podcast. Don't forget to come back to the podcast because it's very important. But the Essenes were the first group who basically said, screw both the temple and screw both political autonomy. We're going to move to the desert, and we're going to come up with our own ideas of ritual purity to make up for the loss of the holiness of the temple. Okay, that's the Essenes. Another group arose that are known as the Sadducees, or the Tzedukim in Hebrew, and these were people that were in sort of the elite, right? It's not necessarily a class thing, but you could think of this as the upper class, the people that were probably the descendants of the Hasmonean Empire, who were used to having power, that when the Romans came in, their main modus operandi was to say, okay, the Romans are here. Let's try to ally ourselves in some way with the Romans and try to work out some sort of deal and compromise, right? The Roman Empire didn't want to deal with, say, running the different neighborhoods that were all Jewish. The Romans didn't want to deal with helping manage the temple in Jerusalem. The Romans didn't want to deal with the collection of taxes from, random Jewish communities in the Galilee and in Jerusalem. And so just like all, good empires, the Romans basically needed, their local puppets to help control the local indigenous people that they are now lording over. And so many of the Sadducees stepped into these roles of basically administrative roles that were connected to the Roman Empire. And so the Sadducees' main position was to say, okay, the Romans are here. Maybe we don't love it, but fine, the Romans are here. And so the Sadducees ended up being the people that were responsible for both the managing and the politics, again, the elite over the Jewish people. And also, importantly, they were still the people who managed the temple. Again, the temple was not destroyed until the year 70 CE. The Romans take over in the early 1st century BCE. This is about 150 years, as the Sadducees were the upkeep of the temple people. But from everything that we've discussed in the last 10 minutes, the Sadducees were also somewhat corrupt, because this lineage of the Sadducees evolving into, the lineage of the Hasmoneans or the Hashmonaim leading and evolving into the Sadducees, there was also now the Roman politics to deal with. The vast majority of Jews looked at the temple as a corrupting enterprise. And this is when you get the Zealots. The Zealots were not super interested or with the temple, right? They were very upset by Roman occupation, and they viewed anybody who had anything to do with Rome as ipso facto evil. It's not that the Zealots were against the temple, but the Zealots understood the enterprise of the Sadducees to be a corrupting enterprise. And the Zealots' position, right, I don't think they refer to themselves as Zealots. This is what Josephus calls them. But the Zealots' main modus operandi was to say, we need political autonomy, right? Political autonomy or bust. And so the Zealots did everything they can to inspire the Jewish people to engage in these wars against the Roman Empire. And of course, there were many wars. If you just look up, Roman Jewish wars, there were many such wars. Of course, the last one in 67, not the last one, actually, sorry, Bar Kokhba was the last one, but the last sort of one in terms of when the temple was still standing in 67 CE, starting that final war that lasted 3 years, which resulted in the temple being destroyed. That was probably because the Zealots were fanning the flames of war and encouraging the people of specifically Jerusalem, but the rest of the Jewish community, to engage in this war against Rome, even though the vast majority of Jews understood that to be futile. It's like you imagine, I don't know, some tiny, group trying to fight against America, right? The Roman Empire was the biggest empire in history, and there was very little chance that Jews would have been able to take back political autonomy from the Roman Empire, even if they were able to manage it for a couple of years here or there over the Zealots. The last group, and then I'll talk about where Jesus fits into this, because I know you are on the edge of your seats, is the Pharisees. The Pharisees, also called the Perushim, right? The Pharisees are the proto-rabbis. And so the Pharisees' de facto view was to say, we don't love the Roman Empire, and we view the Sadducees to be corrupt, but we don't think that we can beat the Roman Empire. So they weren't Zealots, but they weren't exactly Sadducees, because they viewed the current temple with a lot of corruption. They saw the writing on the wall of, there's no way the temple is going to be able to outlast this war that's brewing. And so the Pharisees spent a lot of their time coming up with a portable version of Judaism. Some call it from temple to table, some call it an oral tradition, but they laid the seeds for what eventually became the Mishnah, the first part of the Talmud. Hopefully my listeners are familiar with the Mishnah or Talmud. If not, please go listen to the series on Jewish history, because it is super important for a later understanding of Jewish history and Judaism today. But the Pharisees' view towards both political autonomy and the temple was, they're both important, but right now it seems like it's inevitable that Jews are not going to have political autonomy, and it seems inevitable that the temple is not going to be able to survive, both in terms of the external political forces on the temple and the internal corruption. And so the Pharisees are busy building their schools and laying the groundwork for what eventually became Rabbinic Judaism over the next 2,000 years. Now, Jesus, a first century Galilean Jew, was born right into this mix of different forces. If you read the New Testament, especially from many of the earlier sections of the New Testament, you see a lot of conversations when Jesus is saying that the temple is corrupt, right? They collect money and they use it on themselves and they enrich themselves. This, of course, would later be taken by Christian church fathers as fodder for anti-Semitism. But if talked about in its historic context, Jesus was right there with how the majority of Jews actually felt about the temple. Jesus also didn't love the Pharisaic tradition, right? The Pharisees also end up being the bad guys in the New Testament, because Jesus had this view that the Pharisees were too obsessed with the minutia of law. There's a whole debate in early Christianity whether or not Jesus himself actually wanted to abolish the law, right? There's a famous verse in the New Testament where Jesus said, I am not coming to abolish the law, but I am coming to fulfill it. It's an open question whether or not that meant a ritual fulfillment or a spiritual fulfillment, because early Christianity was very big about being a spiritual fulfillment of the law instead of a physical or practical fulfillment of the law where the rabbis went. But Jesus is right there within this debate, and it is probable that if you went back to the year, say, 25 CE and talked to a young Jesus Christ, that Jesus himself never actually meant to form this new tradition or new religion, right? Jesus was right there in this variety of debates of what is the future of Judaism in this time of flux and turmoil. And again, Jesus probably did not want to be the founder of a new religious tradition. Just two other interesting things to say about that. I always say to students that if you take a time machine to the 1st century or even the 2nd century CE, there would have been no split between Judaism and Christianity as we know it today. Instead, it would have been like, imagine you go to a new city, you're spending the weekend in New York, and you want to look up, different synagogues to pray in on Shabbat. And you see, okay, there's Orthodox, there's Reform, there's Conservative, there's Chabad, there's Reconstructionist, there's Renewal, right? You have the whole smattering of options. And so if you took a time machine to, I don't know, the Galilee in the year 100 CE, it probably would have been the same thing. You would have had all these different synagogues. Some synagogues would have been more, zealot-based synagogues. Again, the zealots end up surviving and end up giving their ultimate attack in the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135 CE. So, some synagogues might have been very politically charged and, quietly whispering, anti-Roman slogans. Others might have been much more, straight-edged Pharisaic synagogues and might have said, to hell with the whole political question. It's all about developing this oral tradition. And you would have had, Jesus following synagogues that would have said, actually, this guy Jesus made a lot of sense, right? He was dead by now, and we should probably follow a lot of his teachings. But in all probability, there wouldn't have been such thing as I'm a Jew or I'm a Christian until at least the 2nd century, but maybe even the 3rd century CE. The other thing that I want to say in terms of, Jesus being the Messiah or claiming to be the Messiah or other people claiming for Jesus to be the Messiah is that for us in the year 2024, somebody claiming to be the Messiah is sort of a big deal. You don't hear it every day. Generally, if somebody told you they thought somebody else was a Messiah, you would rightfully view that person with skepticism. In this period of immense political and religious flux, it was a lot more normal for both individuals to claim themselves was the Messiah and for other people to claim other people was a Messiah. And it probably, and again, I say probably because there is some historic debate about this, didn't have the same eschatological, and that means, referring to end times and, these big wars and, all the stuff that happens at the end of days. It probably didn't have all of these eschatological implications that it does now. And what I mean to say by this is in the, say, 300 years between 100 BCE and 200 CE, there were many, many, many people in the Jewish community that either themselves claimed or had other people claim that they were the Messiah. The other, well-known one, I had mentioned Bar Kokhba before, but Bar Kokhba, the Jewish general that led the Bar Kokhba revolt, was claimed by many, including Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah, to be the Messiah. And so it's not such a crazy claim that people consider Jesus a Messiah. Obviously, in Jewish tradition, Jews have rejected that claim along with all other people that have claimed to be the Messiah in the last many thousands of years. But that is how you situate Jesus in a wider historical setting. All this is to say, it really makes no sense to say that Jesus was a Palestinian. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was from Judea. Jesus was operating within the wider Jewish tradition. And this gets back into why it's not only historically incorrect with all the wrong assumptions going into this claim of Jesus was a Palestinian, but it's also anti-Semitic. And it's not anti-Semitic in a direct way in terms of they're personally attacking me, but it is an erasure of Jewish history. It's an erasure of Jewish connection to the land of Israel. And it's also just an erasure of this long legacy of Jewish history of which Jesus is a part of, whether anybody likes that or not, right? There was actually just, I'm butchering the details and I wasn't planning on talking about this, but there was some controversy. There was some recent movie or Netflix series or something about early Christianity. And I think people were upset that Mary, Jesus's mother, was played by a Jew because they said, well, why is Mary a Jew and not Christian? And this is also historically comical because, of course, Mary was Jewish. If Jesus was Jewish, that means his mom was Jewish. And so just the whole thing is is, covered in, irony, humor, but sad humor. The one other thing that I'll point out about this claim that Jesus was Palestinian is Judas, of course, the Jewish person who supposedly betrayed Jesus. Again, there's a lot to say about the idea that Jews killed Jesus aside, but very few Palestinians are also claiming Judas was a Palestinian, right? They're more than happy to leave Judas being a Jew. So of course you have the dirty Jew, Judas, who is turning in, Jesus the Palestinian. Of course, you can see the analogy there. But no, Judas and Jesus were both Jewish. They were both operating within this historic milieu of the political and religious turmoil of the first centuries, both BCE and CE. The last thing I'll say is just over this question of Palestinian identity. There is a big historic debate when such a thing as Palestinian identity would have formed. And I said before, if you went back to the 1920s, most people who called Palestine a distinct entity would have actually been Zionists. It's funny, there are these posters that say Visit Palestine. You can Google it, and there's these beautiful posters. I think there's some olive trees in the background, and it says Visit Palestine. And recently, a lot of people in the pro-Palestinian movement have been using this to say, see, 100 years ago, before Zionism, this was, Palestine in a distinct area. But those are actually marketing ads from Zionist organizations that were trying to get Jews across the world to visit the Jewish homeland, Palestine. And so it doesn't really matter what you call it Israel, call it Palestine. It is the historic land of the Jews. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean there's no such thing as modern Palestinian people and that modern Palestinian people are not deserving of rights. They certainly are in terms of both of those. There's some question about when distinct Palestinian identity would have formed. Some say, the 1920s. Others say, after 1948, the Independence War / the Nakba. Others say actually after the Six-Day War in 1967. Again, you can do research on this. You don't need me to sort of sprout evidence for all these different theories. But regardless of those theories, now in 2024, there is a people called the Palestinians, and they are deserving certainly of individual rights, right? Maybe you don't want to give them national rights, right? That obviously gets into whether or not you want a, all Israel or a two-state solution or anything like that. But certainly as individuals, they should have equal human rights to all Jews living in the land. But no, these sort of historically specious and shallow and just plainly incorrect claims such as Jesus was a Palestinian is not only wrong, is not only anti-Semitic, it of course hurts the Palestinian cause because it makes it seem like much of the Palestinian claims are based off of zero evidence, which again, when we're going back in history past 100 years ago, is basically true. There was no such thing as a Palestinian people more than 100 years ago. There was no such thing as this land being called ancient Palestine. No, the current Palestinians are not descendants from either the Canaanites or the ancient Philistines or the ancient Jews, as they, sometimes claim. And just the last thing I'll say is, obviously, in early Christianity, there was this idea of supersessionism, which is the idea that Christians are the real Jews and Jews are the frauds. You still see this today in some Christian communities. You also see this in, the Black Hebrew Israelites are very big on this claim of supersessionism, right? They say, we are the real Jews and the current Jews are just, they've actually stolen the claim of Jewishness. The Palestinians, in some sense, are kind of doing the same thing. And a lot of Palestinian activists are doing the same thing, and especially claim saying Jesus was a Palestinian is not only an attempt to erase Jewish history, it's actually an attempt to steal Jewish history. And so if you are confronted with this idea that Jesus was a Palestinian, you can, depending on your mood that day, either engage with it or silently laugh to yourself how wrong and anti-Semitic the person propagating this is. And last thing, feel free to like, subscribe, and share this video. And for anybody that might be celebrating Christmas, Merry Christmas.